The Interstellar Combat Theory Institute orbited the moon of Draxis Prime like a monument to organized violence, which, if you thought about it for more than 3 seconds, was exactly what it was. 63 species sent their best and brightest here to learn the art of not dying in the increasingly complicated business of galactic conflict. The curriculum included everything from theoretical xenobiology warfare to the practical application of making things explode in the vacuum of space. It was, by all accounts, the most prestigious military academy in 7 sectors, which meant the egos floating around inside were dense enough to have their own gravitational fields. Humans had been attending for exactly 4 standard cycles now, ever since Earth's admission to the Galactic Concordance. 4 cycles wasn't long enough to build a reputation, apparently, but it was plenty of time to become the punchline of every joke in the combat simulation labs. The prevailing wisdom among the student body was that humans were adorable in their enthusiasm, but hopelessly outmatched in every measurable category. Too fragile, too slow, too emotional, too weirdly attached to concepts like fair fighting and proportional response. The kind of species that wrote poetry about sunsets and then wondered why nobody took them seriously when they showed up to negotiate territorial disputes. The truth, as with most truths in the galaxy, was significantly more complicated and far more amusing than anyone realized. Professor Zalmar's Advanced Tactical Response classroom was a cathedral to controlled chaos. The main chamber stretched 40 meters in diameter, ringed by observation platforms where students could watch simulations unfold in real-time holographic glory. The center contained the neural link pods, sleek obsidian coffins that plugged directly into a participant's consciousness and threw them into combat scenarios so realistic that 3 students per cycle needed psychological counseling afterward. The walls displayed scrolling data feeds in 17 languages, tracking everything from heart rates to tactical decision matrices, because apparently even war needed a decent user interface. Vexitharan dominated the space like he dominated everything else in his life. Through sheer physical presence and the absolute conviction that the universe had specifically arranged itself for his benefit. He was Crithian, which meant he stood nearly 3 meters tall when he bothered to fully extend his segmented spine, which he did often because subtlety was for species that needed it. His exoskeleton carried the distinctive crimson and black patterns that marked him as warrior caste, 3rd generation, from a bloodline that had conquered 47 systems before the Concordance made that sort of thing illegal and significantly less profitable. 4 arms, each capable of crushing titanium, gestured constantly as he spoke, which he also did often because the sound of his own voice appeared to be his favorite music. The Terran conflicts of the 21st century, Vexitharan announced to the classroom with the confidence of someone who'd never been contradicted, demonstrate precisely why humanity remains a tertiary power at best. Examine the tactics. Ground-based warfare with projectile weapons, air superiority through primitive combustion-based aircraft, and an absolutely baffling reliance on something called rules of engagement. He chittered, which was the Crithian equivalent of laughter and sounded like glass breaking in a cement mixer. They literally wrote down lists of things they wouldn't do to enemies, actively trying to kill them. It's anthropologically fascinating and strategically pathetic. Several students chittered or hummed or bioluminesced their agreement, depending on their species' particular method of expressing sycophantic approval. The Crithians had held the top combat simulation scores for 6 consecutive cycles, and Vexitharan personally had never lost a tactical debate, a simulation match, or an opportunity to remind everyone of those facts. In the back row of the observation platform, Leah Chen continued taking notes with the kind of focus that could bore through hull plating. She'd been sitting in approximately the same position for 3 cycles now, watching, listening, and absorbing information like a biological database with excellent posture. She was human, which meant she was small by galactic standards, barely 165 centimeters, which was adorable to species that measured their height in meters. Dark hair pulled back in a practical style that suggested she had more important things to think about than appearance. Her uniform was regulation perfect, which none of the other students managed because they were too busy being individually special. She rarely spoke in class, and when she did, it was usually to ask clarifying questions delivered in a tone so polite it was almost medical. The other students had categorized her mentally as that quiet human girl, and then promptly forgotten she existed, which was exactly how Leah preferred it. Anonymity was useful. You learned more when people forgot to perform for you. The simulation archives show that Terran military doctrine emphasizes defense over offense. Vexatherin continued, warming to his subject the way some species warm to mating season. They actually take pride in this. Defense. As if the purpose of military force is to not use it effectively. He turned, all 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of theatrical disbelief. Professor Zalmar, I submit that humanity's admission to this institution is an act of charity, not merit. Professor Zalmar was Kiksar, which meant she was roughly spherical, hovered via methods science hadn't fully explained, and communicated through a translation device, because her natural language existed at frequencies that caused most species to develop immediate migraines. She'd been teaching tactical theory for 30 cycles and had stopped being impressed by student arrogance approximately 29 cycles ago. Your submission is noted, Vexatherin, her translator chirped in perfectly neutral tones. Though I might point out that humanity defeated the Chloridian invasion fleet at Proxima with 1/3 of the expected casualties, which suggests their defensive doctrine has at least some practical merit. A lucky engagement. Vexatherin dismissed with a wave of one hand. The Chloridians are herbivores who evolved from prey animals. Defeating them proves nothing except that humans can occasionally frighten creatures that are literally designed to be frightened. A few more chitters from the audience. Leah's pen continued moving across her tablet, documenting everything with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that information was ammunition, and it paid to maintain a well-stocked arsenal. Perhaps, Professor Zalmar's translator hummed with what might have been amusement. You'd like to test your hypothesis directly? The classroom's ambient noise dropped by approximately 30 decibels, which was the educational equivalent of a bomb dropping. Everyone recognized that particular tone. It meant Professor Zalmar was about to make someone's day significantly more difficult in the name of learning. Vexatherin's mandibles clicked together in what could have been excitement or aggression, or possibly both, since Crithians didn't really distinguish between the two. A simulation challenge? Against which opponent? Professor Zalmar rotated slightly, which was her version of looking around the room, though how she actually perceived her surroundings remained one of those mysteries that students wisely chose not to investigate too closely. You've made specific claims about human tactical inadequacy. It seems appropriate that you defend those claims against a human opponent. She paused, managing to inject dramatic timing into a translated mechanical voice. Leah Chen, please approach the simulation pods. Every head, sensor cluster, and optical organ in the classroom swiveled toward the back row. Leah looked up from her notes with an expression of mild surprise, as if someone had just asked her opinion on the weather rather than volunteered her for ritual combat humiliation in front of 40 witnesses. Me, Professor? Her voice carried that same polite neutrality that made it impossible to determine if she was pleased, terrified, or simply confirming she'd heard correctly. You've attended every session this cycle without participating in a simulation. Your theoretical scores are excellent. I believe it's time to translate theory into practice. Professor Zalmar managed to make it sound like an invitation to tea rather than gladiatorial combat. Unless you'd prefer to decline? Vexitharan chittered again, louder this time. Please, by all means, decline if you're frightened. There's no shame in recognizing when you're outmatched. Well, minimal shame. The other students reacted with a sort of anticipatory energy that suggested they recognized entertainment when they saw it being prepared. This was going to be spectacular, and by spectacular, they meant they were about to watch a human get comprehensively dismantled by one of the Academy's top tactical fighters. It would be educational in the way that watching ground vehicles collide was educational. You learned what not to do primarily by observing the consequences of failure. Leah closed her tablet with a soft click that somehow carried across the entire chamber. She stood, smoothing her uniform with careful deliberation, and began walking down the stepped platforms toward the simulation pods with the measured pace of someone who had exactly zero interest in hurrying for anyone's benefit. I accept, she said simply, and several students later swore they heard something in her tone that should have served as a warning, though nobody could quite articulate what. Vexitharan's forearms gestured in triumph. Excellent. We'll use Combat Scenario 17, Urban Warfare, Mixed Terrain, Standard Weapon Loadouts. We'll see how human defensive doctrine performs when offense is required. Actually, Leah said, still walking with that same unhurried pace, I'd like to propose Combat Scenario 23. Multi-level environment, limited resources, adaptive objectives. The classroom's noise level rose again as students processed this development. Scenario 23 was notoriously unpredictable, changing parameters mid-simulation based on participant actions. It was the sort of scenario that separated tactical thinkers from tactical memorizers, and most students avoided it because it made you look stupid in complicated ways. Trying to level the playing field? Vexitharan's mandibles clicked with amusement. Very well, though it won't help. The scenario is irrelevant when one participant is fundamentally superior. Then you should have no objection, Leah replied, reaching the simulation pods and examining one with the careful attention of someone inspecting used transportation for defects. Professor Zalmar's translation device emitted a sound that might have been approval. Scenario 23 is approved. Standard rules: victory by objective completion, opponent incapacitation, or opponent surrender. Lethal force is simulated only. The neural feedback is calibrated to discomfort rather than injury, though I remind you both that psychological damage is your own responsibility. She rotated toward the observation platforms. All students will observe and prepare tactical analyses. This will count toward your participation scores. Which was professor speak for. Everyone watch closely because you're about to learn something whether you want to or not. The simulation pods opened with hydraulic sighs, revealing the gel-cushioned interiors and the neural interface crowns that would hijack their nervous systems for the next however long this took. Leah climbed into hers with practiced efficiency, settling in and allowing the automated systems to position the interface. Vexitharan required a specialized pod to accommodate his physiology, but he entered his with a sort of dramatic flair that suggested he believed someone was recording this for posterity. Any final words before your humiliation? Vexitharan called across the space between pods, because apparently he couldn't resist one more opportunity to hear himself speak. Leah adjusted her neural crown slightly, eyes closed, breathing steady. Yeah, one thing. And that is? Her eyes opened, and for just a moment, something flickered in her expression that was entirely at odds with 3 cycles of polite invisibility. You should have studied harder. The pod sealed. The holographic display arrays lit up across the classroom, showing split-screen perspectives from both participants as the simulation initialized. Students leaned forward, recording devices activated, and the betting pool that technically wasn't supposed to exist updated its odds to heavily favor Vexitharan, because apparently nobody had been paying attention. Professor Zalmar settled into her observation position, and if she could have smiled, she absolutely would have. The simulation materialized around them with the disconcerting completeness that made neural link technology simultaneously impressive and deeply disturbing. One moment, darkness. The next, complete sensory reality that insisted it was absolutely real, even while your higher brain functions screamed that you were actually in a gel pod, back in the classroom. The environment was a derelict space station, artificial gravity failing in sections, emergency lighting casting everything in shades of red and amber. Debris floated in the zero-G areas. The architecture was deliberately unfamiliar, a mixture of different species' construction philosophies meant to ensure nobody had home field advantage. The objective parameters scrolled across their respective visual fields. Secure 3 strategic locations, eliminate opponent capability, or force surrender. Resources were scattered randomly. Weapons were limited to what you could find. Vexitharan immediately accessed his tactical overlay, scanning for power signatures and optimal movement routes. His species had evolved for exactly this kind of environment, confined spaces where strength and reach provided overwhelming advantages. 4 arms meant he could climb, fight, and manipulate objects simultaneously. His exoskeleton provided natural armor, and his neural processing was optimized for rapid tactical assessment, which was evolutionary courtesy of a homeworld where hesitation meant you were dinner. He moved forward with aggressive confidence, claiming the nearest strategic location within 30 seconds. His overlay showed Leah's approximate location 3 sections away. He chittered to himself, already planning his approach. The key was to force engagement in a choke point where her size disadvantage became insurmountable. Humans talked a lot about creativity and adaptability, but creativity didn't help when someone 3 times your mass had all 4 hands around your throat. In the observation room, students watched the split screen with the sort of focus usually reserved for entertainment rather than education. Vexitharan's feed showed aggressive forward momentum, textbook Crethean assault doctrine with optimal route selection and rapid objective securing. Leah's feed showed... well, Leah appeared to be retreating. She'd spawned in a section with failing gravity, and rather than immediately pushing toward objectives, she was moving backward through the station's maintenance corridors, staying low, minimizing her profile. To the casual observer, it looked like panic response. To anyone who bothered to check her biometrics, which exactly 3 students did, her heart rate was perfectly steady at an almost meditative 60 beats per minute. "This is embarrassing," one of the Crethean students muttered. "She's running." "Can you surrender before first engagement?" another asked. "That seems efficient." Professor Zalmar said nothing, but her translation device emitted a brief tone that she only used when students were being particularly dense. Vexitharan secured his second objective point, a command station overlooking 3 major corridors. He'd found a plasma rifle with 40% charge, which was more than enough for what he needed. His tactical overlay showed Leah still in the maintenance sections, moving erratically. Wounded prey, he thought with satisfaction. Time to demonstrate the difference between warriors and whatever humans thought they were. He advanced toward her last known position, moving through a zero-G junction with the practiced ease of someone who'd trained in variable gravity since childhood. His forearms gripped surfaces, pulled him forward, rotated him through openings with brutal efficiency. This was what Crethians did. This was what they'd done across 47 systems before someone made them stop. Leah's voice crackled through the station's emergency comm system, which shouldn't have been accessible because it was supposed to be non-functional set dressing. "Vexus Theron, you there?" He paused, mandibles clicking in confusion. "How are you accessing station comms?" I asked nicely. Her tone remained that same polite neutral that was starting to feel less polite and more like something else entirely. "Quick question. In all your studying of human military history, did you happen to review our naval tactics? Specifically submarine warfare?" "Submarine." He pulled himself through another junction, scanning for her heat signature. "Primitive waterborne vessels are irrelevant to orbital station combat." "Probably," she agreed. "But the tactics are universal. Thing about fighting in a submarine is that you can't win through direct confrontation. The other guy always has torpedoes too. So you know what wins submarine battles?" Vexus Theron entered a large chamber. Looked like it had been a cargo bay once. His tactical sense screamed warning half a second before the explosive decompression hit him. A section of the outer hull, pre-weakened, detonated outward. Emergency bulkheads should have sealed immediately. Should have. Instead, atmosphere vented violently, dragging everything not secured toward the sudden opening to vacuum. Vexus Theron's forearms scrambled for purchase, catching a support beam, arresting his momentum through sheer strength. His exoskeleton automatically sealed against vacuum exposure. Training kicked in. He oriented, assessed, prepared to... The explosive charges on the support beam detonated. In the observation room, several students made sounds of surprise that translated across species lines into roughly, "Oh hell." Vexus Theron tumbled into vacuum, spinning, disoriented, trying to activate his suit's maneuvering thrusters, except the electromagnetic pulse that detonated immediately after the explosives had fried every electronic system within 20 meters. He hung in space outside the station, watching his tactical overlay dissolve into static, completely helpless as momentum carried him slowly away from the hull. Leah's voice came through his suit's backup audio system, which still worked because it was mechanical rather than electronic. "Patience. That's what wins submarine battles. You be more patient than the other guy." She appeared in the cargo bay opening, wearing a functioning vacuum suit she'd apparently assembled from scattered components, holding a magnetic grapple launcher that absolutely should not have been available in a section she'd previously occupied. She fired the grapple past him, not at him, letting the line drift by at a distance just barely beyond his reach. "I've been watching you for 3 cycles," she said conversationally, like they were discussing the weather instead of his complete tactical humiliation. "Every simulation you run, same pattern. Aggressive advance, secure power positions, force engagement in kill zones you control. Textbook Crethian doctrine. It's very effective against people who fight the way you expect them to fight." Vexus Theron twisted in space, trying to alter his trajectory through sheer muscular effort, which didn't work because physics didn't care how strong you were. "Here's the thing about humans," Leah continued. And now there was definitely something in her voice that hadn't been there in the classroom. Something sharp and precise and completely done with being underestimated. "We're not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most naturally armored. But we are, and I cannot stress this enough, absolutely spectacular at learning exactly how you fight and then doing something completely different." She triggered her suit thrusters, moving parallel to him, maintaining the distance. You studied human military history and learned that we value defense. Which is true. But you know what's funny about studying history from the outside? You miss the context. You miss why we value defense. And the reason, Vexatheron, is not because we're scared of offense. It's because defense is cheaper. And every time in human history we've actually needed to go on offense, actually needed to end something, we've gotten real creative real fast. She reached the grapple line, caught it, began pulling herself back toward the station. Also, submarines don't fight fair, just so you know. Vexatheron floated helplessly, watching her disappear into the station. His suit's emergency beacon was non-functional thanks to the EMP. His trajectory would take him past the station's gravitational influence in approximately 4 minutes. The simulation would probably reset him once he passed a certain threshold. But by then, she'd have secured all 3 objectives and won through points. Which was exactly what happened. In the observation room, silence had achieved a quality that could have been manufactured into hull plating. Students stared at the holographic displays showing Vexatheron's perspective. Endless spinning stars and the distant shrinking shape of the station, with the sort of stunned incomprehension usually reserved for discovering that gravity had taken the day off. Did she? One of the Crithian students started. She spent the first engagement mapping his tactics. Another student, a Kiksar named Melzin, who'd actually been paying attention, said quietly, everything that looked like panic movement was preparation. She found components, set charges, hacked the emergency systems, and then invited him into a trap disguised as a target. But that's... Someone else tried to find words and failed. Asymmetric warfare. Professor Zalmar supplied helpfully. A concept humans developed extensively during their pre-space era. When facing a superior opponent, you don't engage on their terms. You change the terms. The simulation ended with Leah securing the final objective point. The pods opened with simultaneous hisses. Students unconsciously leaned forward as both participants emerged. Because if there was going to be violence, it would probably happen now, and nobody wanted to miss it. Vexatheron extracted himself from his pod, with movements that were significantly less dramatic than his entrance had been. His mandibles clicked repeatedly in a pattern that suggested he was processing several complicated emotions and having trouble prioritizing them. He stood at his full height, looked down at Leah, who was checking her uniform for gel residue with casual focus, and seemed to be trying to formulate something to say that wouldn't make this situation worse. Leah finished her inspection, looked up at him with that same polite, neutral expression, and waited. You... Vexatheron's translator struggled with whatever he was trying to express. That was not honorable combat. No, Leah agreed simply. It was combat. You hacked station systems. They were available resources. You set a trap. You walked into it. You used tactics that aren't documented in any training manual. It's kind of the point of creative tactics, Leah said reasonably. If they're in the manual, they're not creative anymore. They're just answers to a test everyone's already studied for. Vexatheron's 4 arms gestured in directions that didn't seem to have specific meaning beyond expressing general agitation. Professor Zalmar, surely this violates some rule of engagement. Professor Zalmar rotated slightly, her translation device managing to convey deep amusement without changing tone. Which rule specifically? She used available resources, achieved objectives through tactical planning, and at no point violated the scenario's parameters. The fact that her approach was unexpected is not a rules violation. It's called being better prepared. But I studied. I've won 63 consecutive simulations. You studied how to beat people who fight like you were taught to fight. Leah said, still in that same reasonable tone that was somehow more devastating than any amount of gloating would have been. I studied you. There's a difference. She paused, then added with what might have been the faintest hint of actual emotion breaking through the professional facade. Also, you've spent 3 cycles insulting my entire species in a classroom where I was sitting right there. Did you think I wasn't paying attention? Or did you just assume I was too stupid to understand I was being mocked? The silence in the observation room achieved new depths. Several students suddenly found their tablets extremely interesting. A few had the decency to look uncomfortable. Vexatheron's mandibles stopped clicking. Something in his posture changed, not collapsed exactly, but settled, deflated. When he spoke again, his translator conveyed something that might have been the Crithian equivalent of genuine confusion. You let me think you were harmless. I let you assume whatever made you comfortable, Leah corrected. There's a difference between deception and allowing someone to deceive themselves. You saw a small human taking notes quietly and concluded I was irrelevant. That's not my failure. That's yours. She picked up her tablet from where she'd left it beside the pod, checked something on the screen, then looked back up at the classroom full of students who were rapidly recalculating their assumptions about the quiet human in the back row. Humans have been fighting on our planet for roughly 12,000 years, Leah said, addressing not just Vexatheron, but the entire room. We fought each other in every terrain type you can imagine. Jungles, deserts, oceans, mountains, Arctic wastes, urban centers, underground tunnel systems. We've fought with sticks, swords, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, and strongly worded diplomatic letters. We've studied war like some species study religion because, for most of our history, it was the primary factor determining who survived and who didn't. She took a breath, and her voice remained level, but somehow carried more weight. So yeah, we value defense. We value rules of engagement and proportional response and treaties that limit what weapons we use. You know why? Because we know exactly how effective offense can be. We know what happens when you take the gloves off. We wrote the manual on total warfare and then collectively decided that manual was too horrifying to keep using. Leah looked directly at Vexatheron. Your species conquered 47 systems using tactics that worked because your opponents didn't know what was coming. That's not strategy. That's advantage through ignorance. Humans have been fighting other humans who know all our tricks, all our doctrines, all our weaknesses for 12 millennia. We got good at it because we had to. And then we joined the Concordance and decided to be polite about our capabilities because we were trying to make a good impression. She paused, and now there was definitely something sharp in her expression. But polite isn't the same as harmless, and underestimating someone because they're being polite, that's just bad tactical assessment. Professor Zalmar's translation device emitted what was absolutely approval this time. An excellent demonstration of practical tactical theory. Both participants displayed competence. Vexatheron's approach was technically sound and would have succeeded against most opponents. Leah's approach demonstrated adaptive thinking and superior pre-engagement intelligence gathering. This is why we study multiple doctrines rather than assuming any single approach is universally superior. She rotated to address the class. Homework assignment, tactical analysis of this engagement. Minimum 3,000 words. Due next session. You're all dismissed except... She rotated toward Vexatheron and Leah. You two. The classroom emptied with a sort of speed that suggested students were eager to begin gossiping immediately, probably establishing which of them had been most vocal about human inadequacy and whether they should preemptively apologize before it became socially necessary. Once the observation room cleared, Professor Zalmar approached the simulation pods. "Vexitharan, I trust this experience has been educational." His mandibles clicked slowly, processing. Yes, Professor. I made assumptions that were not supported by adequate intelligence. An appropriately diplomatic phrasing for "I was arrogant and got comprehensively demolished," Professor Zalmar said, because apparently even ancient alien professors enjoyed a good roast occasionally. "I suggest you spend additional time studying human military history with greater depth. Focus particularly on their guerrilla warfare traditions, asymmetric tactical development, and the concept they call special operations. You'll find it illuminating." Vexitharan nodded stiffly, then turned to Leah. For a long moment they regarded each other, the towering Krithian warrior and the small human who just dismantled his ego with the precision of a surgical strike. "You were right," he said finally. "I should have studied harder, and I should not have assumed my physical advantages translated to tactical superiority." He paused, mandibles clicking in a pattern that might have been embarrassment. "I apologize for my disrespect." Leah regarded him for a moment, then nodded once. "Accepted. For what it's worth, your fundamentals are solid. You just got comfortable winning the same way every time. That's fixable." "Perhaps," he said slowly. "You might share some of your analysis. I would benefit from understanding how you identified my patterns." Something that might have been respect flickered across Leah's expression. "Sure. I've got 3 cycles of notes. Fair warning, it's going to hurt your ego." "I believe my ego has already received sufficient damage for one day," Vexitharan said, and there might have been the beginning of humor in his tone. Professor Zalmar's translation device emitted a satisfied hum. "Excellent. Productive learning through traumatic experience. Education at its finest." She rotated toward the exit. "Leah, a word before you leave." Vexitharan departed, moving with significantly less theatrical flair than usual. Leah waited, tablet held casually, expression back to that neutral professionalism that made it impossible to guess what she was thinking. "You've been holding back for 3 cycles," Professor Zalmar said without preamble. "Your theoretical scores suggested competence, but that—" She gestured toward the simulation pods. "That was exceptional. Why?" Leah considered the question with visible care, then shrugged slightly. "Seemed smarter to observe first. Learn the environment, understand who I was dealing with, figure out where humans fit in the social structure here. You don't show all your capabilities immediately when you're the new species trying to establish credibility." "And Vexitharan's provocation?" "Was an opportunity," Leah said simply. "He made it personal and public, which meant responding would be noticed. Better to establish human capabilities through demonstration than through boasting. Let the results speak." Professor Zalmar's translation device emitted a tone that suggested deep satisfaction. "You'll do well here, Leah Chen, though I suspect you'll find the remaining simulations significantly less quiet than you prefer." "Probably," Leah agreed. "But that's fine. Being underestimated gets boring after a while anyway." She nodded respectfully and headed for the exit, leaving Professor Zalmar floating contentedly in the empty observation room. If she could have smiled, really properly smiled in the way humans did, she absolutely would have. The next morning, Leah arrived to Advanced Tactical Response to find her usual back row seat occupied by Vex Theron, who'd brought what appeared to be a Crithian data tablet and approximately 4 different note-taking implements. "I researched human guerrilla tactics overnight," he announced without preamble. "Also your submarine warfare, special operations history, and something called asymmetric engagement doctrine. I have questions. Approximately 200 questions." Leah paused, considered this development, then sat down in the adjacent seat because apparently her anonymity was officially over. 200 seems excessive. Narrow it down to the 50 best. The Viet Cong campaign in your 20th century, the tactics don't make sense according to standard military theory, yet they were effective against a technologically superior opponent. How? Patience, terrain advantage, and willingness to play a longer game than the opposition wanted to, Leah said, pulling out her own tablet. Also comprehensive understanding that technology has to be deployed effectively. And if you make deployment difficult enough, the technology becomes irrelevant. Vexatheron's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "This relates to your simulation approach. You negated my physical advantages by forcing engagement in an environment where they couldn't be applied." "Exactly. Never fight on the enemy's preferred ground if you can help it." "But how do you train for environments you can't predict?" "That's question 2, Leah said. "You've got 48 more. Let's be efficient about this." Other students filtered in over the next few minutes, and the sight of the top Crithian combat student being tutored by the quiet human generated the sort of buzzing speculation that would fuel social conversations for the next 3 cycles minimum. Several students who'd been particularly vocal about human inadequacy suddenly discovered they had urgent business elsewhere. Professor Zalmar arrived precisely on time, surveyed the classroom with whatever sensory organs she actually used, and if her translation device could have conveyed smug satisfaction, it absolutely would have. "Today's topic," she announced, "is adaptive tactical thinking in unpredictable environments. We'll be examining case studies from various species' military histories, with particular focus on how inferior forces have successfully engaged superior opponents." She rotated slightly, and everyone in the classroom knew she was looking at Vexatheron and Leah. "I trust yesterday's practical demonstration has prepared you all for this subject matter." The chittering and humming and bioluminescent flickering from the student body suggested they were indeed prepared, though possibly not in the way the professor meant. Leah opened her notes, prepared to take her usual meticulous documentation, and discovered Vexatheron was already recording everything with multiple devices because apparently getting comprehensively demolished in front of 40 witnesses had seriously upgraded his study habits. "Question 51, he muttered. "Why do humans have 17 different words for camouflage? And what are the tactical distinctions between them?" "That's actually a good question," Leah admitted. "Short answer: context matters. Long answer: you're going to need another tablet." In the front of the classroom, Professor Zalmar began her lecture on asymmetric warfare principles, occasionally gesturing toward historical examples from Earth with what might have been pointed emphasis. And if she noticed the complete reversal in classroom dynamics from yesterday, she gave no indication beyond a faint hum from her translation device that suggested deep, profound satisfaction with how education occasionally corrected itself through practical demonstration. The Interstellar Combat Theory Institute continued orbiting Drax's prime, still a monument to organized violence, still training the best and brightest from 63 species. But now, just possibly, with a slightly more accurate understanding of what best and brightest actually meant when it came to the small, polite species from Earth who wrote poetry about sunsets and then systematically dismantled your tactical assumptions when you stopped paying attention. Turned out the humans weren't just adorable in their enthusiasm. They were professionally, competently, creatively dangerous when circumstances required it. And if you'd bothered to study their actual military history instead of skimming the entertaining parts, you'd have learned that lesson without needing to be personally demonstrated in front of an audience.